What's going on, Forceful players? Ryan Miles here from Alter Reality Gaming, here to do a bit of a meta breakdown, given that the current format that we're in, we just had 3 Grand Prix over the past 2 weeks in this format, and we will have, at least in America, 3 more, with North Carolina next month, Minnesota sometime at the end of April, and then finally somewhere in the mountains of New York we will have a Grand Prix in May, and that Grand Prix will be the same weekend as the new set comes out, or at least the pre-release for it, so it will still be the current New Frontiers format. So we've already had 3 GPs of results to look at, and we have 3 more GPs to come, and we've already had very different results, and I would expect to see the meta continue to evolve because we do have a very balanced format where there are a lot of viable decks, and the best deck at any given time is really not a definitive single deck like we've seen in the past with Scheherazade, with Prisia, and with Fox and things like that, but it's actually based on what you expect the rest of the players at the event to play. There is not even a triangle, there's like a meta star or like a pentagram going on, but I want to kind of just go through like a thought process that I use to approach when I'm thinking about what I should be playing for a metagame. So we're going to start from the top basically with, as you can see on the screen, is Gill. Gill was, I think, the most successful deck this past weekend, and that was largely in part because the format was very mid-range oriented. All the Hanzo and the Brunhilde decks were very mid-rangey, and Gill, as just a slightly slower kind of control deck, was able to prey on those very effectively, and also has life gain tools to make sure it doesn't automatically lose to aggro decks. So Gill was first place in GP Berlin. It took top 4 in GP Vegas, and then took 2nd, 3rd, and 4th at the Australian GP. So that's kind of going to be our starting point, right? So what does Gill do? It's a slower, control-ish deck that grinds out the game and then takes complete control, makes sure your opponent doesn't have any plays that they can do, removes all of your resonators using the white leaf, or sorry, blue leaf, red leaf, black leaf, depending on like what they are. Arrival of the Hero is a very powerful card. 5th Element, Leaf Assassin, and finally they just kill you with like hitting you with Gill and Winds of Vitality and like maybe some other pump spells. So that's kind of what the deck does. It's particularly good against the mid-range decks because it doesn't... The mid-range decks can't put on enough pressure quickly enough to kill Gill, as well as like aggressive decks can do. So Gill has the time to kind of get its setup going. It can use its efficient removal to remove expensive resonators like anything that costs 2 or 3 mana, really. And then it'll stabilize, start using its engine to start to stack all the time, and like have even more efficient removal spells because 5th Element will have multiple elements in hand to use, and that's kind of what the deck does. But there are natural predators for this deck. If you remember back when Time Spinning Witch was like the popular deck and we were all kind of worried about Gill actually being the most terrifying thing, the black-white Brunhilde deck had its first iteration. I think there was a tournament in somewhere in Southeast Asia, maybe it was Japan, that built this black-white Brunhilde deck playing Jeanne d'Arc, playing the Reanimate, a black Resonator rune, but in general people were able to figure out pretty effectively that the Gill decks kind of just have a very difficult time dealing with Jeanne d'Arc Mad Maiden. Because it becomes indestructible if you just flood out a bunch of guys. The Gill deck has very efficient single target removal, but it does not have very efficient mass board removal. So Jeanne d'Arcs can be particularly difficult to remove. Cards like Ray the Black Owl are also another example of a card that's just like difficult for Gill to really remove effectively. So when you build up a big board of Skeleton Hordes and Jeanne d'Arc Mad Maiden and Ray the Black Owl, there's just not a lot that Gill feels really comfortable in its initial, in its initial 40 anyway, or initial 45. You can side into Black Tears, but that still doesn't deal with the Jeanne d'Arc problem. And then because you kind of need to flip your ruler to search for Black Tears, it makes your ruler vulnerable to being attacked by Jeanne d'Arc, and then the -1/-1 counter stick, and it becomes easier to kill Gill as the game goes on. And Gill isn't a deck that's going to win the game very quickly. It's going to just try and run you out of cards. And when in the black decks that we've seen March of the Dead is a new resource that lets you bring back two 2-drops from your graveyard, and that's going to bring back the Jeanne d'Arcs that maybe Gill does find time to remove. It's just a very difficult matchup for Gill. So Jeanne d'Arc, any Jeanne d'Arc deck, I would say the best version is going to be Lucifer. If you look at the Berlin top 8, Philip Hubjord's topped with the Jeanne d'Arc the Mad Maiden Lucifer deck, and I think that's the natural predator for Gill. And it was a little bit underrepresented because it has its own bad matchups, but I think if we wanted to start from the top and say, okay, this is the metagame, we know that Gill is currently the best deck, air quotes, then we want to play Jeanne d'Arc decks. Okay, well, let's take it a step further, right? Let's say that we think that everyone's going to play Jeanne d'Arc Lucifer decks because they're all trying to beat Gill. the next step for that is playing Brunhilde. Brunhilde has a lot of resources to beat the Jeanne d'Arc decks because it has efficient single target removal that is even more efficient than what the Lucifer Jeanne d'Arc stuff is doing. Blade of Faith, Blade of Faith is just 1 mana, exile target Jeanne d'Arc. Not only does that get around its indestructible ability, it gets around the reanimate effects like March of the Dead. So we already, like, that's just the hardest counter in I think the entire game to like that strategy. Like Jeanne d'Arc as a card is super good at countering Gill specifically, and then Brunhilde has this tool in Blade of Faith that just exactly counters Jeanne d'Arc, like irregardless of what the rest of the deck is doing, right? But on top of that, the Jeanne d'Arc Lucifer deck is very much an aggressive deck, and then Brunhilde has a lot of mid-range life gain tools and even more removal to make sure that it's not going to die. Another angle that the Jeanne d'Arc decks typically take is they will play some discard, so they get to look at your hand and then, you know, discard your most threatening things. But they are typically mono black or black red. Brunhilde gets access to cards like Life Stealing Altar, which is an addition, and the black red color combination has no addition removal whatsoever. So you really can't ever run Brunhilde out of cards. But on top of that, it just main decks Messenger of the Sun. Yeah, Messenger Sun. So that's even more card draw. Like, Brunhilde is naturally immune to being ran out of cards. It's just a little bit on the slower end of actually killing you as a mid-range deck. So, like, Jeanne d'Arc decks are the faster, more aggressive mid-range decks. Brunhilde's a little bit slower, has a little bit more removal, and therefore kind of falls prey to Gill a little bit more than like the Jeanne d'Arc decks do. But Brunhilde is, I guess, if we're taking this, you know, from Gill down to Jeanne d'Arc decks, the next step is saying, okay, if everyone's going to play Jeanne d'Arc decks, then we want to play Brunhilde. So, okay, what if we're going another step further, right? Let's see how far down this rabbit hole we can go before we actually cycle back up to the top. So if we think now that everyone's going to play a Brunhilde deck, we play Pandas. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not playing Pandas. We're going to play a Hanzo deck. I have Jizzo statue up here because I think it's just like the hardest thing for the Brunhilde deck to deal with. Brunhilde, obviously, Blade of Faith kind of deals with this, but the Hanzo decks have Whirlwind Technique. They have Sealing Scroll. They've got just Violas to stop Orphica and the air loop from happening. Like, there's just so much interaction in green, and it's always cheaper than what the Brunhilde deck wants to do. Obviously, Brunhilde has Blade of Faith, and that's probably the only thing that's at parity with what a green deck wants to do. But if you look at Spear of the Valkyrie, you've got Table Flip, you've got Fair Spell, you've got Sealing Scroll even. So you've got this 2-mana card that gets countered by 1 or 0 mana answers in green. If you play Mistletoe and you want to get back a guy, or if you play Air, if you play Orphica to try and flicker a Jizzo statue, all countered by Lorite, all countered by 1 mana. So despite the fact that the Brunhilde deck is a little bit slower on the mid-range end, and we did also see like a more aggressive Brunhilde deck that did top 8 GP Vegas, piloted by Joshua Patton. In general, the green cards are always more efficient because there's so many green cards that are 1 mana and also very good. So again, that is Fair Spell, that is Lorite, that is Whirlwind Technique. And even just in terms of board wipes, you have Rapid Fire Me and Sandstorm, which is like 6 mana, 6 damage to your opponent's board for only 1 mana. Green is super good at beating those slower-ish mid-range decks and just killing them very quickly. Hanzo is also kind of favored against the Jeanne d'Arc decks because of cards like Table Flip and, again, like Lorite and Viola and stuff like that. But green doesn't have the card generation that those other 2 mid-range decks do, right? When it comes to beating Brunhilde, green really has to do it using Jizzo statue because you don't have the time to go to the long game because eventually white will draw more cards than you and green will not. So we know that green is going to be playing the aggressive side against the Brunhilde deck, but it is weaker to running out of cards. And that's where we get to the next step in this list, and that is the Lucifer decks. Not just the Jeanne d'Arc decks. I'm talking Athenia, Soul Prison, Belial, Full Control, like Hand Destruction, Look of Corruption, Glint of Insight, Lucifer. Like the grimiest control that you can think of. And that is exceptionally powerful against Hanzo because as soon as Hanzo starts running out of cards, it just does not have the capability of reloading anymore. The Rune deck could play Forest Meditation or Wrap Downstream, but then it's actually kind of throwing its very favorable matchup against the stuff like Hanzo and the aggressive Jeanne d'Arc lists. And even the aggressive Jeanne d'Arc lists have an interesting matchup where you have discard, so it's not like the end of the world playing against Hanzo, but I do think Table Flip kind of makes a favorite. But anyway, like if you really want to just beat Hanzo, right? If you expect 40% of people at this event to play Hanzo, then I would say just play Control Lucifer, because that matchup is just insanely favored. So then, okay, what do we want to do to beat Control Lucifer, right? Like, what brings it all the way, like, what's going to be the next step in the puzzle? And it's just Gill. You know, Gill is going to have more cards because Gill has the ability to go infinite, because it can just constantly, like, if you look at my hand and you discard cards out of my hand, I'm just going to discard elementals, I'll shuffle them back to my deck and draw more, right? Like, Gill is always going to have those tools. There's nothing particularly threatening that Lucifer can do that Gill can't deal with particularly easily, using cards like Arrival of the Hero and then big 5th elements and stuff like that. And Black Lucifer control doesn't have any life gain outside of like Estima, but again, Estima just dies to Leaf Assassin, it just dies to 5th element, it dies to even Elemental Blast if Gill is ambitious enough to play that, Ruin Stories, things like that. So Gill really has the edge against Lucifer because Lucifer wants to run Gill out of cards, and Gill is especially immune to that because of the resources it has available. And if Gill does play the addition that like turns all of its spirit magics into stuff, then it's like kind of a wash. You get so much card advantage from that that it's kind of ridiculous. So we've come full circle, right? We've got our metagame mostly defined now, where we've got Gill somewhere at the top is what we're thinking, and then if we want to beat Gill, we play Jeanne d'Arc. If we want to beat Jeanne d'Arc, we play Brunhilde. And if we want to beat Brunhilde, we play Hanzo. And if we want to beat Hanzo, we play Control Lucifer. And that brings us back to the top of Gill. So we have to think, how many steps down from the top are most people going to play? And then what is the best counter to that? And then how do we take that deck that we've chosen and then hedge our badge matchups based on how much we expect them? And that's it. That's pretty much all 5 decks that you can play in the entire game of Force of Will, so that's really all I need to talk about. Except, of course, that's not true. We do have other decks like Ayu, like Pandas, and like Kirik. So where do these other decks kind of fit in here, and then how do you assess those when you're trying to choose what deck you want to play? Well, it's mostly it's a simple thing to do, where you just kind of say, okay, what is my best matchup, right? What kind of role am I filling? Well, for Kirik, what's Kirik's closest approximation here? It's not really going to be Gill, because Kirik and Gill are 2 very different decks. It's not going to be Brunhilde because it's a life gain deck versus like an aggro deck, right? You know, most of these make sense. It's very, I think, obvious that the most similar thing to Kirik in this lineup here is going to be the Jeanne d'Arc decks. It's an aggressive deck. The Kirik deck wants to just play a bit more aggressive, and it's instead of having the stickiness and the more high value cards that a Jeanne d'Arc deck has, but it kind of fills in the same role, right? If I'm expecting a lot of Gill at this event, and I want to play a deck that loses to Brunhilde, I should play Kirik. Kirik is going to have a worse matchup against Gill because it doesn't have the same kind of advantages of Jeanne d'Arc. But if you do play like 4 Play Dead in your deck, or if you play the Tournament Bracelet, then Gill can actually have a kind of difficult time dealing with you because their answers are not as efficient as your proactive threats. It really comes down to that major turn where they flip their ruler and how many Arrival of the Hero they can get off, and how many Play Dead you do or do not have. That's kind of like the defining factor of what make or breaks that matchup. And it's really just like how teched the Gill is for you and how teched you are for them. But you're still going to lose to Brunhilde 99% of the time, same as the Jeanne d'Arc deck. So that's kind of where you slot in there. And you can do that with any deck and just kind of figure out, like, okay, if I'm going to play a Brunhilde deck, like, I know that I'm going to be pretty much equally favored against the Jeanne d'Arc and the Kirik. I don't need to think too hard about, like, the differences between them, because where they slot in there is kind of the same thing. It gets a bit more complicated when you start doing things like Ayu, because there are no real big Jade Ruler decks, but Ayu is going to kind of come in between the Lucifer and the Gill, where it's going to beat Lucifer every single time, but then it's going to lose to Gill almost every single time, at which point you have to ask yourself, why would I even play Ayu if I'm pretty much filling the same slot as Gill while losing to Gill? And then Kirik's doing the same thing here. Kirik is pretty much filling the same slot as Jeanne d'Arc Lucifer, and it has like a 50-50-ish matchup against Jeanne d'Arc Lucifer, because Jeanne d'Arc Lucifer has Black Rosario, which is pretty efficient. And the same thing goes with like Freyla. Freyla's another aggressive deck that kind of fits in this slot where we have the aggressive decks, right? It's like hard control that like has a strong win condition into aggro decks, into like a bit more mid-range into hard control again, with like the purest form of hard control back into control. It's like this sliding scale of like aggro to control with like mid-range in between, and just kind of like what happens each way. So any deck you can pretty much think of can kind of slot into this like scale somewhere. It's not exact, but like that's kind of where I ended up on my Hanzo decision for GP Berlin, right? My expected turnout was going to be a lot of Kirik and a lot of Brunhilde, and I didn't expect a lot of Lucifer control because I was expecting Lucifer to lose to the Kirik decks and the Gill decks. That's like where I thought the metagame was positioned. So because I thought that Lucifer was a deck that just wasn't going to exist, the hard control Lucifer, I said, okay, I think Hanzo's the one that's going to have the least worst matchups and the most good matchups. If I ever played against a Lucifer deck, probably would have lost, but I made the correct call in assuming that I just wouldn't find any of the hard control Lucifers based on where I thought the meta was positioned. So moving into the next event, we have to think perspective has changed. You know, it's no longer Brunhilde and dArc decks that are Brunhilde and Kirik and Hanzo were the expected decks going into it, but now we know that Gill is a very serious threat. So now we expect to see more of the dArc decks. And what happens when we expect to see more of the dArc decks? What should we play to beat that? I think that we move towards a bit more Brunhilde, specifically the aggressive Brunhilde variant, because that deck has a better matchup against Gill than the slower Panda variant. And from there, we'll see how North Carolina goes. And even if what I just said is true, by the time we get to Minneapolis, it'll have changed again. So you really just need to think about where you think the meta is going to be, and then also, you know, make some spicy brews. See if you can find something that will beat every deck that you expect to see, and then hard lose to the decks you don't expect to see. And that's a very difficult thing to do, obviously, but that's part of the fun for deck building for card games. So that's it for me today. Hope I gave you guys something to think about, and I'll catch you next time.